Welcome to the Geoeconomics Podcast. I'm your host, Aleksa Burmazovic, and today I'm speaking with Dr. Dragan Kostić. So a bit of housekeeping before we start with the call. Originally, the conversation that I had with Dr. Kostić took place in Serbian, so for that reason we dubbed it over for international listeners. For that reason, the conversation is a bit shorter than most of the conversations that we have on the Geoeconomics Podcast, but I think it's well worth listening to. Dr. Kostić is the president of the Chamber of Commerce for the city of Pirot in Serbia, and is also a long-serving CEO for the eponymous Pirot Free Trade Zone. And I connected to Dragan in 2020, and he quickly became something of a mentor to me. The conversation that we had just now goes into some of the basics of Serbia's free zones, like how Serbia's zones will survive COVID and entering the European Union, funnily enough. It's a bit on the short side, but easily our densest conversation so far. So I hope that the dub does justice to Dr. Kostić and I's conversation. And without further ado, here's Dragan.
And here I am with Dr. Kostić. Dragan, how are you doing today?
Hello, I'm doing excellent. Having lovely sunny weather here in Pirot.
Thank you for coming on to the podcast. This is an episode I was looking forward to for a long time. As you know, I'm born and raised in Serbia, and you're from here as well. To me, SEZs are something comparatively recent that I've been in since only 2016-17, and I was wondering what your history is with SEZs and free zones. How did you come to be active in this sector?
Well, it's incredible how the time went by. In 1994, I got in touch with starting the Pirot Free Zone for the local government and a tire manufacturing company called Tigar, whom I was working with at the time. And since 1994 to now, so 27 years, we took 25 years to win the Financial Times Award for the best free zone in Europe. That was in 2018. We also got in third place worldwide that year, and that was really something we're proud of. In all that time, I'd gathered best practices and professional experiences from the most important zones in the world, and since then I'd also had a PhD and master's program that I completed at the University of Belgrade, with a specialization in free zones and SEZs.
And I mean, speaking of Belgrade, it has a free zone, as do other places in Serbia like Kikinda and Apatin and other places in Serbia. Is that something that was reproduced from Pirot's experience, or how did the idea of free zones spread through Serbia?
Well, when it comes to the history of free zones in the region, it goes back to the Roman times. There were small free cities where caravans could stop for a visit, but it didn't have too much economic freedom, as it were. In 1917, the port of Rijeka in Croatia became the first free port, then the city of Zadar in 1923. Even then, that city had some Hong Kong-style preferential regulation going on. In 1929, the first Serbian free zone was established, but in Greece, if you can imagine it. The port of Thessaloniki, until 1974, had tariff and export preferences for the Yugoslavia of that time, making Thessaloniki one of the main ports through which Yugoslavia did its trade towards the eastern Mediterranean. As time went on, two free zones in Yugoslavia shaped up, one in 1963 and one in 1985. The first free zone law in Serbia was in 1994, and the next one in 2006. These laws allowed for the development of zones, and I myself was included in the drafting of the law. We figured out how to create export processing zones in Serbia, which made obsolete the 11 existing trade zones, replacing them with 4 free zones which were production and export oriented. At the moment, Serbia has 15 free zones and €6 billion worth of goods moving through them every year. Exports, somewhere more like 3 billion. Investments into Serbia's zones every year are something to the tune of 300 million euros. It didn't start with us. It started way before. We were just able to make it into something that works with modern and globalized markets. Since the 1960s and the Shannon free zone, we observed how things developed and did our best to implement the best practices and even improve on some of them.
About that, is there anything in Serbia that Serbia was really able to capture and be best in class at? I'm thinking about, when most people think SEZs, they think, the Emiratis figured it out. That's where all the best practices come from. So is Serbia a place that merely implemented best practices, or is there something that we really came up with that hadn't been done before?
Well, sure, there's a couple of things that we're really good at. No free zone framework I came across makes it easier to become a client than the Serbian framework. All you really need as an international or domestic company is sign one contract with the zone management company. That's all you need to do. That concept is a bit more complicated with other places. Northern Macedonia has a really solid zone concept, but the government there needs to approve each tenant before they're allowed to move into the zone. In Serbia, however, after you sign the contract with a free zone, essentially of the zone management company, all the border crossings in Serbia receive a memo of exemption and you're allowed to function in the privileged zone system. I think that kind of simplicity, in my opinion, it's a big strength, and it's rare in the world where you always have to have some limiting factor. On the other hand, free zones in Serbia offer exemptions to all taxes except corporate profit tax, but that's really omnipresent in most zones, so it isn't worth dwelling on much. There's competition there, but it's not very innovative. The simplicity of procedures and the user experience is something that I think is the most important aspect we got going on, especially regarding customs. At the free zone of Pirot, we process one truck's worth of goods every 5 minutes, and our users, be they the producers or traders or anyone else really, doesn't have to wait long at the border. So that's the transparency of approach we got going on, and quick passage of goods. Recently, we've had big supply chain issues that have impacted a lot of places, and Serbia, as a logistical hub, still hasn't been hit very hard by that. That is because of, and not in spite of, the free zones.
And that's a thing I noticed while traveling to Bulgaria and other places. The Dimitrovgrad border checkpoint is very rarely congested with truck traffic, in the way, for example, Horgosh on the Hungarian border in the north, or other border crossings in Serbia are. And there are often lines of trucks waiting to be processed at the border like several kilometers long. And that might have to do with the EU, but speaking of the EU, I'm also thinking about the advantages that Serbian free zones offer to our tenants. What's interesting to me is that Serbia as a country is trying to enter the EU, and the negotiations for that have been going on for years now. And as you know, there's the regulatory harmonization thing going on in the EU, and that makes free zones sort of a state aid somewhat, it makes it like a no-go kind of thing. So if that happened, if Serbia became an EU member state, what would that mean for Serbia's free zones, for example?
Well, we have an answer for that, but it's not something that we came up with. It became prominent when Hungary ascended to the EU, and at that time there were cross-border trade zones between Hungary and Austria. So we're thinking about how that developed in Hungary and how we can figure our way out of it, and what the next step in development is. There are two ways to go about it. A regionalization model, such as what happened in Poland, where the SEZs were grandfathered in. These were bonded warehouses, walled-off zones, and there's the cross-border zone as the other option, which would avoid all of those procedures affecting people working on both sides of the border. The free zone would avoid that. As far as the border crossing near Pirot, we were thinking of a cross-border free zone close to the Bulgarian border that would expedite the processing of goods passing through one way to the other. There's a lot of legal procedure that needs to happen, and some other stuff, but we in the field will try to implement this type of solution at the border crossings.
Yeah, I mean, Poland is fascinating as a case study because it was able to be grandfathered in the zones that it has in Lodz and other places. Poland, of course, holds a really important position between the Western markets like Germany, and it bridges it with Eastern Europe, Russia specifically. And I think Serbia finds itself in a similar position. Serbia bridges Central Europe to the countries of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Black Sea. There's a strategic location to where Serbia is as well. And now I'm thinking, and I'm interested in terms of our zones, is the geostrategic capacity of Serbia fully utilized? We've all sort of heard the stories that we're the crossroads of Europe, that we're the east to the west, and we're the west to the east, and all of that. So I'm wondering, from your point of view as somebody who's been active in the zone space for a long time, is there an additional zone that we should have, or which we don't, or should we not have zones? Like, have we reached our full capacity with zones?
I'd say we have enough zones, but I definitely agree that the logistical hub should be the beating heart of every zone, particularly in bimodal transport in Serbia. This means moving goods from rail to road transport and vice versa. Those types of hubs don't exist yet in Serbia. Or more specifically, they exist, but they aren't free zones, so we're trying to get that done in the Pirot free zone. The point is that those places need to ensure the fastest possible traffic and the simplest possible procedure for moving goods through. Those types of logistical hubs don't have to be in free zones, but they can, particularly because of those processes, like paying taxes and customs and all that. The efficiency I'd spoken about before in customs procedures would, I think, really come to shine in those types of zones. Tri-modal free zones and logistical parks are something that's really important as well. For example, there's a park in eastern Serbia getting built called the Prahovo Chempark, owned by a chemical concern called Elixir Group. Of course, it'll be supported by the government as a strategic project, and there will be a tri-modal terminal. The Danube river, rail, and road transport will all meet in one place, all under the free zone regime, choosing which type suits your goods best. Also, there's going to be a river container transport terminal, which will allow that interoperability as well. So the reason I'm saying this stuff is because COVID-19 has caused a massive disturbance in global supply chains, and we have to regionally, in some way, substitute those logistical bottlenecks that have been choked by the virus.
Understood. And with regards to Prahovo, something I'm interested in that's for chemical industry, light and heavy, and so it has certain infrastructure requirements that the zone is able to cover. So what I'm thinking about is the difference between traditional and more up-and-coming industries. There's been all sorts of innovations I'm sure you've seen coming out of, well, not necessarily free zones, but in Serbia there's a lot of software and digital stuff emerging as sort of the result of the government supports for entrepreneurship. I think it's called the Serbia Builds program or something like that. But as far as Serbia's free zones go, are they mostly oriented towards logistics and chemical and manufacturing and all the legacy stuff, or is there more stuff like software and innovative technologies and stuff which is more directed to the, lean startup sort of mentality as opposed to the capital investment, heavy stuff like chemical and logistical and so on?
The zones are open to all comers, regardless of manufacturing, trading, or other orientation. We do prefer innovative directions in particular, though. All the free zone advantages are open to any company that's ready to take advantage. The 4.0 industrial revolution is something that we're really keen on capturing and exploring in the zones. The WFZO, World Free Zones Organization, is really interested in offering resources and best practices in how zones can drive innovation for Industry 4.0, and I'm really excited to work on that as well. The implementation of this industrial revolution will, I think, have to happen in places like zones in these hotspots of industry and logistics and all that. That's exactly what you were saying just now. As zones are preparing for the new wave of industries, that's something that requires these zones to be networked together to make happen. The knowledge network that zones create will make this wave of the future be distributed equally and more quickly throughout the world, especially with all of the tools that the fourth industrial revolution brings. It's like a tool that speeds up its own acquisition. All of that should be applied in free zones and have them networked in improving their services to be more open to the fourth industrial revolution. The most successful zones will be those which can offer the best services. It'll be kind of a race to the top, where the tenants will do their activities and invent the new wave of technology.
I strongly agree. I really wouldn't want to see a future where zones just undercut each other with tax policy or try to attract tenants by saying that they're willing to turn a blind eye to their things and regulate less. If it were a race to the bottom scenario, if it's just who can do less for their tenants, that seems to me like a way to get nowhere fast. Tenants choosing a zone on the basis of which services can be offered to them and what benefit they can extract, that seems like a much more valuable and meaningful way of connecting not just zones, but all of these innovators as well into a network that will create much more value than this system of just cutthroat, backstabbing industrial parks, which are just, trying to watch out for the bottom line. As far as the international network goes, you mentioned the WFZO, the World Free Zones Organization. You're quite high up in that organization. I'm interested in how you arrived there. I know the center of their operations is closer to the east, like the Emirates and those places. So I was wondering, how did you come to be in the WFZO?
Well, as I mentioned, I've been on the ground for a long time. We know all the people that are in the free zone space, and the contracts on the human level are really the most important point of reference for anybody trying to get things done. There have been a few organizations that have been influential in the free zone space even before the WFZO. The World Trade Organization was quite bashful and distant from the free zones. They didn't really work too closely with them. The ILO, on the other hand, the International Labour Organization, they were very interested in free zones for accountability reasons. UNIDO and UNCTAD, two of the sort of United Nations economic task forces, were very much active in the space. And these UN task forces were assisted by organizations such as WEPZA, the World Export Processing Zones Associations. So, in the 90s, the Free Zone in Pirot became a member of WEPZA. We did so in Flagstaff in the USA, and we were hosted by the creator of WEPZA and somebody who is sadly no longer with us, a man of great vision, Richard Bolin. In any case, he made WEPZA, which was the first organization of production-based zones. Then after that, there was FEMOZA, and then more regional organizations like the South American Free Zones Organization, African Economic Zones Organization, and now we arrived at the WFZO as an organization. In 2001, there was a World Free Zones Convention, but at the time it was still an event series about free zones and not the WFZO that we know today. Not really. WFZO was created in 2014, so we've been around about 6 or 7 years now, and at that time it was mostly been in Geneva, but it originated in Dubai with the help of the United Arab Emirates and Dubai itself. The WFZO has been able to unify quite a number of free zones worldwide under a sort of single umbrella. It's a bit more complicated than that. There's a lot of work being done. The WFZO is very dedicated to our work, and if you want to, you can just go to the website and see all the projects that are going on there. In any case, we're all involved in this work, and the WFZO is, safe to say, the leading free zones organization in the world right now. I'm really impressed by the map that you guys at the Adrianople Group came up with and your dedication to all of this. It's a really fresh wave of energy that I appreciate, and that the people that I speak to as well appreciate. We're all becoming a single network, just all of these organizations and people who are true believers in the concept of free zones and what they're able to do. People who want to position it properly in this coming wave of industry, making it more concentrated on the unique geographic and logistical advantages, and less the rent-seeking stuff that you mentioned.
Oh, absolutely. I'm really glad that all of these organizations came about. I mean, really standing on the shoulders of giants like WEPZA and FEMOZA did their work at a time when it was really difficult to do so, building the foundation that we were fortunate enough to build this network on. And the database that we created will hopefully provide a similar impetus to the free zone generation that comes after. Not just the zones, but also the people working inside of them. Hopefully, it'll help people achieve really massive things that they wouldn't be able to otherwise.
Yes, and I would add something else that's interesting and should be taken into account. The latest UNCTAD directive from the 7th World Investment Forum is that the free zones of the world should be unified under a single banner to be called the GASEZ, the Global Alliance of Special Economic Zones. UNCTAD as well as the World Free Zones Organization are both included, and I invite you to hop into that as well, and anybody else who wants to contribute to free zones. It's a new thing, and I really wish it all the success in the world. I like it, because it will make everything that we've been speaking about gain all the networks and resources that were not available there previously for free zones. That will make zones able to function at a significantly higher level than ever before, achieving some really massive things.
I think 2022 will be a truly massive year for free zones, and will open the road for the 2020s to be a phenomenal decade for the sector as well. It'll be really exciting now that the UN is supporting the implementation of SEZs worldwide, and new generations of experts are now coming in and bringing in all sorts of new perspectives. I mean, what about your veteran angle of looking on things? What do you think the next 10 years will bring into the SEZ space? And by that, I mean not just which zones will rise and fall, but also which technologies and developments will arise through SEZs. I mean, I was recently speaking to Yandex, the Russian tech company, and they'd had self-driving cars being experimented with in the Technopolis Special Economic Zone near Moscow. So I'm interested in what you're seeing as advanced technologies or economic developments that will arise from SEZs in the coming future.
I mean, the free zones of the coming 10 years, and we touched on this already, absolutely need to be on the forefront of Industry 4.0. And that's what zones are able to support through their services and value addition, contributing to all of these modern and cutting-edge sectors in a way that allows them to bring about some really meaningful and powerful developments. Something that I hope you'll be able to see in your lifetime, Aleksa, is a free zone on Mars. And I'm not exaggerating at all here. I think it's probable. If a human does set foot on Mars in the coming century, I guarantee that a logistics gate and free zone will be soon to follow.
If I live to see the Olympus Mons free trade zone.
I mean, what else should we shoot for? It absolutely follows that it has to happen. It'll be an international point of trade that everybody will eventually end up using. I truly believe that, really.
I find myself agreeing with you. One of the persons who's the key promoter of this Mars colonization push is, as you know, Elon Musk. And I'm sure that you know as well that he's an ardent user of free trade zones and SEZs and all sorts of arrangements of that type. I mean, all of the Tesla Gigafactories, the manufacture batteries for his Tesla vehicles, well, I mean, most of them are in various types of SEZs worldwide. I'm thinking like China, the USA. The advantages differ from country to country, but the point is that Elon understands the concept of SEZs and doesn't shy away from it. Something that I'd be supremely interested in. Could we reach that person or those similar to him who are able to reach Mars and have that be the grand vision for free zones in the next 30 years? That's a bit outside the scope of what I'm able to make happen right this second, but having a free trade zone on Mars may very well end up being my life's goal.
Well, we have no other real option.
Well said and well thought. Speaking of your thoughts, you mentioned that you had a PhD and Masters in free zones. Where can we find you on social media as well as your thoughts and work in the field? Perhaps some of our listeners would want to see your thesis as well.
Oh, certainly. My thesis was the influence of free zones on the restructuring of the post-transition economy of Serbia, so we can see if the predictions that I had set out ended up coming true. I think Serbia's free zones succeeded to a large extent because of their diligent implementation of best practices. Every zone in Serbia has at least one internationally recognized company active as a tenant, from Swarovski and Siemens in the north to Michelin and Linglong in the south, in Pirot. Hopefully, Pirot will be one of the key free zones worldwide for the rubber industry, as we've certainly got the positioning as a logistics hub as well as the infrastructure for it. That tells us the zone was well conceived and equally well executed. To anybody who's interested in the subject, obviously the first stop for a lot of the documentation and study you do would be UNCTAD, the World Bank, and there's a lot of really dedicated individuals who brought us so much in this space. I'd really like to mention Richard Ballin and Robert Haywood from WEPZA, though the organization doesn't really exist in the same way it did before though. Also Juan Torrents from FEMOZA, a friend of mine, then Mohammed Alzarooni, then Samir Hamrouni and Martin Ibarra, all from the WFZO. They've written quite a lot about the subject. Of course, you can find my own thesis on my LinkedIn, so that's sort of the network that I'm working with.
Well, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast. If you have any last messages for the podcast, that'd be really great. Our listeners often work in zones or logistics one way or the other. So any closing thoughts?
Thank you. I really believe in the mission of what we're doing at both WFZO and Pirot, as do people like Aleksandar Simonovic and many others across Serbia who believe in this concept. I trust that you'll still be around when these celestial, extraterrestrial, these Martian free zones become a reality, and that you'll look back on this conversation and hopefully fondly remember my words.
Dragan, I'm really glad to have had this conversation with you. I'd love to treat you to lunch sometime, and it's really heartening to hear that there are veterans like you who never lost faith in the concept of free zones, and I'm really grateful that you came on today.
And thanks to you as well, Aleksa. I wish you and all the listeners many moments of freedom in the free zones that we'll all be building together.
Right on. And to our listeners, if you're looking for more about special economic zones, you can subscribe to us on YouTube if you want. You can find us on Twitter at Geoeconomics Pod. You can get us where you get all of your podcasts, be that iTunes, Stitcher, or Castbox, or any of the rest of them. Another thing that might be interesting for you is the Open Zone Map, where we've listed all of the special economic zones of the world. That's openzonemap.com, and we'll see you on the next one.